This week on Brian Ross Investigates, the first sons, Donald Trump's sons and daughter, under investigation. And now we learn so is Joe Biden's son.
Now, more than a year later, it turns out the laptop and at least some of its contents are in fact real.
The children of presidents have long been the subjects of public scrutiny and oftentimes public scorn. We'll get the latest on the politics of investigating the first family's children. Prize-winning investigative journalist David Cay Johntson, plus a former top CIA operative on the latest from Ukraine and the miscalculations and folly of Russian President Putin.
It's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin has wildly miscalculated. First the resolve of the West, second the resolve of Ukrainians, but third the performance of his military.
And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite.
Why can't you condemn this as an invasion?
Well, don't be naive.
From the studios of the Law&Crime Trial Network in New York City's Herald Square, this is Brian Ross Investigates. And good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined by my colleague Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with the first sons. We've been hearing for years about the investigations involving the grown children of Donald Trump. But now the New York Times is reporting a serious federal investigation of President Biden's son, Hunter.
That's right, Brian. The case was initially dismissed during the last presidential campaign season as unfounded, and some reports were actually blocked from social media.
The Post claimed that the emails were found on a laptop computer that was brought to a repair shop in Delaware in the spring of 2019. And a shop employee saw the emails and then was worried about getting in trouble or getting in danger, and he made copies of them. There's a lot about this story that does not add up.
Feels like a repeat from last cycle. It's but her emails again, and it's kind of ridiculous.
Then and now, the goal of these incidents appears to be the same: to cast a cloud over the frontrunner in the closing weeks of the campaign using a drip, drip, drip of emails that create the air of scandal, even though Republican-led congressional investigations have never uncovered any evidence of wrongdoing.
This is a classic example of the right-wing media machine. A tip from Bannon and a hard drive dump from Rudy led a former producer for Sean Hannity's show to write a story for the New York Post that gets splashed on the front page.
The New York Times has authenticated emails that appear to have come from a laptop abandoned by Hunter Biden in Delaware. The president previously said that the New York Post story about this was a bunch of garbage and that it was a Russian plant. Does he stand by that assessment?
I've pointed the Department of Justice and also to Hunter Biden's representatives. He doesn't work in the government.
And to get a better understanding of what's happening here, we're joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter David Cay Johntson, who's written a number of books about the Trump family's problems and issues. Now, David, as you look at what's happened with this report about Hunter Biden, he's under serious investigation, according to the New York Times.
Yes, and the Biden administration has left the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in Delaware, who is in charge of this, in his post specifically so that no one can accuse them of interfering in what's going on. Now, this investigation, it turns out, dates all the way back to 2019. It could involve the Foreign Agents Registration Act and more than $1 million of income taxes that Hunter Biden should have paid and didn't. He has since paid them, which complicates bringing a federal tax charge. But the Biden White House is letting this case proceed under the direction of a Trump appointee.
Is it likely that President Biden's son could be indicted before President Trump's grown children?
Yeah, I think at this point, Brian, that is a distinct possibility. On the other hand, there's a problem the Justice Department has with the case. There's no question that Hunter Biden, a self-described drug addict, his behavior is smarmy, as has been the behavior of sons and brothers of presidents all the way back to Bushrod Washington, the first president's son. But they have to prove criminal intent. And the New York Times' most recent story very carefully walks through this and shows that, well, he took steps to avoid coming into the Foreign Agents Registration Act and indicated he wouldn't do this or that. doesn't appear to be anything, at least from the reporting in the New York Times, where I used to work, that shows criminal intent, just smarminess and thoughtlessness.
Indeed. David, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
And at the same time, the Trump investigation seems to have hit a roadblock in the Manhattan District Attorney's office. Is that investigation just stalled, or is that one dead?
Well, it appears that Alvin Bragg, the newly elected district attorney in Manhattan, has killed that investigation. He says it's going forward, but evidently there are no more witnesses being called before the grand jury. And the two lead prosecutors, one of whom is literally the expert on RICO statutes, resigned on principle. Now, the state attorney general of New York, Letitia James, has only civil authority inherently, and she is pursuing a civil case against Trump. I think it would be incumbent on Alvin Bragg, if he sees a problem with this case, to give Letitia James, as the law provides, his criminal authority to investigate. And it's one of the things I've noticed about this from the reporting on it. It appears that Alvin Bragg was concerned that Trump lied to banks by inflating the value of assets. If the banks didn't lose any money, I can see the difficulty in making a case like that, Rhonda. On the other hand, he told tax authorities this piece of property is worth $1.3 million. This is his golf course in Westchester, as both Brian and I reported at the time. And then on a federal forum, year after year, he says it's worth more than $50 million, and he publicly says more than $100 million. And there are a number of other buildings where he did this. So I'm frankly very surprised that Alvin Bragg has turned out to, apparently have a jellyfish's spine.
David, as you know, just before the election, the stories in the New York Post essentially were kept off social media. They were blocked. Was that a mistake, looking back at what we now know?
Yeah, I think we need to allow a much more robust debate, even though lots of things on social media are nonsense. And we know that there's a great deal of Russian disinformation out there. And I don't have any examples, but I'm sure that there's also Iranian, North Korean, and various other governments misinformation out there. The reporting in the New York Times, which the right has said, you had a headline about it. They finally admit something. I just went back and reread it. It's actually a model of how to deal with uncertain facts, particularly in an environment where we know the Russians have planted information. It's actually was quite thorough, as is the current story, very nuanced. And frankly, you could use it as a model in journalism school. And I'm not a journalism school product, but use it as a model in journalism school to teach, here is how to report neutrally and in depth when you don't know all the facts.
All right. David Cay Johntson, Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter. As always, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you, Brian and Rhonda.
Up next, we'll talk with a former top CIA official. What's coming next from Vladimir Putin? You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network.
Hi, this is Dan Abrams with exciting news for all of our Law and Crime followers on YouTube. You can now get the live Law and Crime Network with YouTube TV for all of your daily live trial coverage, legal news, expert analysis, and original true crime programs. Subscribe to YouTube TV today and then locate Law and Crime in the channel guide. And for only $1.99 a month, you can add the network to your bundle. Watch Law and Crime every day with YouTube TV. We put you in the jury box.
We turn now to the world's dismay at what's happening in Ukraine, with some intelligence analysts suggesting Vladimir Putin could be prepared to dangerously escalate a limited war into a world war.
To get a better understanding of what's happening, we're joined now by Marc Polymeropoulos, who for 25 years served in the CIA, retired as a senior intelligence officer. He's now a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of the new book, Clarity in Crisis, Lessons Learned at the CIA. Marc, thanks so much for joining us. You know all about Russia. What's going on, do you think, based on what you know about their operations?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and what an extraordinary time. I mean, I don't think any of us really predicted a land war in Europe. But it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin has wildly miscalculated. First, the resolve of the West. Second, the resolve of the Ukrainians. But third, the performance of his military, which has been absolutely atrocious. So there's a lot to unpack here. But I'll tell you this, on your bingo card, several months ago, you didn't have a land war in Europe on there. And so, pretty incredible developments that really are affecting the world.
Given the miscalculation of Vladimir Putin, what's his next step? They talk about he could escalate to actual chemical or limited nuclear attacks.
Sure. So, I think there is some concern on that. But, at some point, the West has to show continued resolve and not really be paralyzed by this this WMD blackmail. I would hope that there's private messages being sent, today through military to military channels, that any introduction of WMD inside Ukraine will, in fact, cause a response from NATO. And I think one of the reasons why, as well, is European public is not going to sit by and simply allow this to happen. I don't know if a public statement, from President Biden or the administration is required. That might box in Putin too much, but clearly telling him behind the scenes that this is a red line, and we're using that famous term red line, but this would be unacceptable. As bad as the atrocities are now, the idea of chemical or God forbid, nuclear weapons being used, that cannot be allowed to stand. And I think we have to really set that, firmly in motion. It should be done behind the scenes.
The U.S. and our NATO allies are moving lots of ammunition and weapon systems into Ukraine. You know all about how that works. How does it work, and what happens if Russia tries to attack those supply lines or the depots where the new equipment is being stored?
Well, Brian, first and foremost, this is in the DNA of, frankly, the intelligence community, the CIA, and the special operations community. I mean, when you look at European Special Operations Command, what's called SOCEUR, for 70 years, it's been waiting for this moment to resist kind of a Russian invasion in Europe. So we do have the ability, logistically, to push, weapons across international boundaries, and for it not to be seen. I think you raise a really interesting point. Will Russia, take that step and try to interdict some of these? Again, it depends if it's on the Ukrainian side of the border or perhaps in Poland or other places. But I think the Russians have threatened to hit these convoys. We have to keep pushing them across. And again, if required, it goes more from overt shipments to covert shipments. But we can do that. Again, that's in our DNA. It's what we've done for decades. And I think that's what we'll do.
I don't want you to give away any secrets, obviously, but what are your former colleagues doing now? And what would you be doing if you were still on the job at the CIA?
What a great question, because I think for a lot of us, this conflict really has resonated. Let me just kind of step back for a moment. Think about the last 20 years where we've had, frankly, less than perfect moral clarity in our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a little different. And so, this is a kind of a classic case of David versus Goliath, of good versus evil. So in some ways, I think a lot of us wish we were there. What are my old colleagues doing? Well, first and foremost, let's paint the picture that there has been, since really 2014, a good 7-8 years of established ties between the Ukrainian and the U.S. special operations and let's just say national security communities. Let's keep it nebulous with that. So regardless of whether our folks, both in the intelligence community and the special operations community, are inside or not, and I don't know, there still are ties, and so there would be certainly communication, that's going to our colleagues on the Ukrainian side, provision of intelligence, certainly as has been reported, helping with kind of logistic shipments, weapon shipments going across. But here's a key piece that I think people are missing. There's been a lot of talk about, the transfer of MiGs, and this kind of blew up in public. I think one of the most important part of the ties between the Ukrainian and U.S. national security components, particularly intelligence special operations side, is the Ukrainians are going to tell us what they really need. Not necessarily MiGs, but what type of equipment do they need? And this can be then passed forward, obviously, to the Pentagon and the White House for approval. So, that to me is the critical part. On the ground fighting, what do Ukrainians need on a daily basis? That's where we can come in, even if these communications are cross-border.
course, the U.S. has incredible abilities at signals intelligence. So we're listening to what's going on with the Russians, and their reports are actually using commercial cell phones because their communications are so messed up. So how valuable is all of that information and intelligence?
Oh my goodness, it's huge. I mean, one of the things is I think the one of the stories of this conflict will be intelligence collection. So first and foremost, it's pretty clear to me, and I don't know, but it's pretty clear to me that Western intelligence obtained the war plans for Ukraine, and that was critical as we briefed our foreign partners, our NATO allies, and got them on board. But as you see the Russian kind of incompetence, their use of unencrypted communications is a boon for us. Obviously, this can be intercepted much more easily. It can be passed to our Ukrainian counterparts. Perhaps the Ukrainians are doing it on their own as well. But again, it goes to the bigger picture of kind of the catastrophic failure of what we thought was a more powerful Russian military machine. I think the intelligence community nailed it in terms of predicting the invasion. Frankly, I mean, it's clear, we did so in fine fashion. But I think there should be, an after action later on. Is I think we got wrong, the assessment on the prowess of the Russian military. I mean, I think people are pretty shocked at how poorly they have performed, from using conscripts to an inability to kind of coordinate between air power and forces on the ground, logistics. I mean, even stories of expired MREs and Russian forces nearly starving. Pretty incredible how poorly they've performed. So I think we do have to look at that down the line.
And finally, let me ask you: many military analysts are saying the next 2 weeks could be pivotal. What should we expect to see?
Well, I think again, there's going to be the Russian use of, the Russian tactic, as we saw in Grozny, as we saw in Aleppo, of bombarding cities, of leveling, civilian structures, and we might see a lot of civilian carnage. It's going to be pretty awful. I think that it's going to be very interesting to see kind of internally from inside Russia. You see reports now that there may be dissension, for example, within the FSB, the internal service, who does have a responsibility for Ukraine as well. And so will there be kind of fractures inside Russia, not only amongst the people on the street, and we haven't seen all that much protest, but that could change, but also really with that security elite around Putin. As Russians continue to come home in body bags, and there are astounding numbers. I mean, there are numbers out there that suggest the Russians have lost more soldiers than the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And so as that continues, we have to see kind of these fissures inside Russia if that increases. And I think that will be pretty telling. That'll put a lot of pressure on Putin.
Marc Polymeropoulos, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thanks so much.
Up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined now by Aidan McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite. And Aidan, you've chosen as your winner this week Margaret Brennan, the anchor of the CBS Face the Nation program, after a tough interview with the Chinese ambassador to the U.S.
Why can't you condemn this as an invasion?
Mm-hmm. Well, don't be naive. Condemnation.
It sounds naive to say that's not an invasion. It
doesn't solve the problem. I would be surprised if Russia will back down by condemnation. What is urgently
will they back down if your president asks Vladimir Putin to back down? Will your president ask Vladimir Putin to back down?
We have done so.
Aidan, all the right questions without being strident.
That's true, and I just want to say that Margaret Brennan is perfectly equipped for this kind of interview. She has a background in world affairs. She was a State Department correspondent for CBS News. Now she's the anchor of Face the Nation. And not only does she have that incredible experience, she's also one of the best interrogators, best interviewers on television. So when she had the chance to interrogate the Chinese ambassador to the U.S., she really asked tough questions. She asked why China, which is pretty much allied with Russia, would not condemn this as an invasion, because as we know, Russia is still calling this kind of farcically a special military operation. They're declining to call this an invasion. He dodged on that question. She continued to press. She also asked him about alleged genocide of Uyghur Muslims in China, which is something that I think every Chinese government official should be asked about when they are interviewed on American television. So asked really tough questions, didn't relent in following up on them, and delivered a stellar interview.
Exactly, and doesn't care if he never comes back because he didn't like the interview. For the loser this week, you've chosen, once again, Candace Owens. Listen to what she had to say.
Again, going back to my point of people being stupid, he's not trying to commit a genocide of the Ukrainians. That obviously makes no sense because there is no difference ethnically from Ukrainians and Russians. Obviously, Ukraine wasn't a thing until 1989. Ukraine was created by the Russians. It was, they speak Russian, so it's absolutely ridiculous.
So Candace Owens, once again, her unique take on world events.
Right. So Candace Owens, obviously a conservative pundit. She is a host for the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's news outlet. She has, since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, presented pro-Putin talking points. Now, I think that's mainly because she's a contrarian. She, as you can see there, doesn't have a full grasp of historical events. Of course, Ukraine was a thing before 1989. And just because Ukraine has a certain history doesn't give Russia the right to invade and conquer it. It reminds me of an essay that David French, the conservative writer, wrote for The Atlantic, where he described Candace Owens and others like her, like Tucker Carlson, as textbook contrarians. They are, and I have his quote here, both excessively cynical about certain things and excessively credulous of others. So in this case, she's excessively cynical of the Ukrainian case for their invasion by Russia and excessively credulous of what Russia says is their right to invade Ukraine and occupy it.
So you could have picked her or a whole group of people who've taken similar positions that appear to be very pro-Putin, pro-Russian.
Right, and it's also, not only are they anti whatever the current common wisdom is in the United States, they're also just far too credulous of what the Russian position is on this. Now, I think no matter what the historical differences are between Ukraine and Russia, she's right. Ukrainians, a lot of them speak Russian. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, speaks better Russian than he speaks Ukrainian. That doesn't give Russia the right to invade a sovereign country and bomb it to smithereens.
And in this case, President Putin has said that Ukraine does not or should not exist, and they seem to be picking up on that line. All right, Aidan McLaughlin, editor-in-chief of Mediaite, thank you so much for being with us this week for the winners and losers. And thanks to all of you for watching. We'll be back again here next week on the Law&Crime Trial Network.